November 30th, 1939. The Karelian Isthmus, Finland. A Soviet T-26 tank rolls through the snow-covered forest, part of a column advancing toward Finnish defensive positions. The crew feels safe. Their armor is impervious to rifle fire. Finnish forces have almost no anti-tank weapons. Then a figure emerges from the tree line. A Finnish soldier, no older than 20, carrying nothing but a glass bottle filled with liquid. The tank's machine gunner opens fire. Too late. The bottle arcs through the air, spinning end over end. It shatters against the tank's engine deck. Liquid splashes across the hot metal. A rag fuse ignites. In 3 seconds, the entire rear of the tank is engulfed in flames. The engine seizes. Smoke pours from the vents. The crew bails out, uniforms on fire, straight into Finnish rifle sights. The weapon that killed them cost approximately 5 cents to manufacture. A glass bottle, some gasoline, a rag, nothing more. A glass bottle, some gasoline, a rag, nothing more. The Finns would use these improvised weapons to destroy hundreds of Soviet tanks during the Winter War. They gave it a name dripping with contempt. The Molotov cocktail, named after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who had claimed Soviet planes were dropping food, not bombs, on Finnish cities. The Finns replied, "If Molotov is bringing us food, we'll bring him drinks." This primitive weapon would spread across every front of World War II. It would be perfected by Soviet engineers into something far more sophisticated. And it would prove that sometimes the simplest solution is the deadliest. The problem facing the Soviet Union in 1941 was catastrophic. Operation Barbarossa had shattered Soviet defenses. German Panzers were racing toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. Soviet tank production could not keep pace with losses. Anti-tank gun production was even worse. The Red Army was bleeding to death from 1,000 mechanized cuts. By August 1941, the Soviet Union had lost. Over 20,000 tanks destroyed or captured. Thousands of anti-tank guns abandoned during retreats. The western industrial regions captured by Germany. Soviet infantry divisions found themselves facing German armor with almost nothing to stop it. The standard Soviet anti-tank rifle, the PTRD-41, could penetrate approximately 25 mm of armor at 100 meters. Against early Panzer IIIs, this was marginal. Against Panzer IIIs with upgraded armor, it was useless. Against the new Tiger tanks appearing in 1942, it was laughable. Anti-tank mines worked, but required preparation. You needed time to lay minefields. During the rapid retreats of 1941, there was no time. Artillery could destroy tanks, but artillery was being lost faster than it could be replaced. And artillery required complex logistics, trained crews, ammunition supply, forward observers. Soviet infantry needed something that required no training, could be manufactured anywhere with basic materials, cost almost nothing, could be carried by any soldier, actually worked against German armor. The Finns had shown the way during the Winter War. Soviet military observers had watched Finnish soldiers destroy Soviet tanks with improvised incendiary bottles. The concept was brutally simple. You didn't need to penetrate armor if you could set the tank on fire from outside. But the Finnish approach was too unreliable. Simple gasoline with a rag fuse often extinguished before igniting the fuel. Sometimes the bottle didn't break. Sometimes the gasoline didn't ignite at all. Soviet engineers needed to perfect what the Finns had improvised. They needed a weapon so simple a conscript could use it, so cheap that millions could be produced, so reliable that it would always ignite. And they needed it immediately. The task fell to the Soviet chemical industry, already working at maximum capacity to supply conventional munitions. But this weapon required no special facilities, no precision machinery, just chemistry. The breakthrough came from understanding what actually destroyed a tank when it burned. The 3 mechanisms of tank destruction. Mechanism 1. Engine seizure. Tanks require constant airflow to cool their engines. When burning liquid coated the engine compartment, two things happened. First, the fire consumed oxygen. The engine suffocated and seized. Second, the heat caused metal components to expand and warp. Pistons bound in cylinders. Valves froze in place. A tank with a seized engine was immobile. Immobile meant vulnerable. Vulnerable meant dead. Mechanism 2. Crew asphyxiation. Burning gasoline produced massive amounts of carbon monoxide. This gas was heavier than air and sank into vision ports, hatches, any opening. The crew had two choices: stay inside and suffocate, or bail out into enemy fire. Both choices were fatal. Mechanism 3. Ammunition detonation. If fire reached the ammunition storage, the entire tank detonated from within. Soviet chemists developed multiple formulas, each optimized for different scenarios. Formula 1. KS mixture, alcohol-based. Early incendiary bottles were unreliable. Some failed to ignite, others burned too quickly. Many were dangerous to transport and handle. Soviet chemists approached the problem as an engineering challenge, not a field improvisation. They experimented with alcohol-based and fuel-based mixtures, seeking a balance between flow, adhesion, and ignition reliability. Early solutions improved spread across engine surfaces, but introduced new problems, including toxicity and instability during storage. The critical breakthrough came when engineers focused on viscosity. By thickening fuel, they created incendiary compounds that clung to vertical surfaces instead of dripping away. These mixtures burned longer, hotter, and more predictably than liquid fuel alone. Equally important was ignition. Early methods relied on burning cloth fuses, which were unreliable and dangerous. Later innovations eliminated external ignition entirely by using self-igniting chemical reactions triggered only upon impact. By 1942, the incendiary bottle was no longer an improvised weapon. It was a standardized, factory-produced system. Millions were produced across the Soviet Union, filled in distilleries, factories, and field depots. They were labeled, packed in crates, and distributed like any other military supply. The economics were staggering. An incendiary bottle cost a tiny fraction of a single anti-tank round. Yet one successful throw could disable or destroy a tank worth hundreds of thousands of rubles. The cost-effectiveness was almost absurd. If you're finding this look at Soviet improvised warfare interesting, a quick subscribe helps the channel grow. Now let's see how these primitive bottles performed when Soviet soldiers threw them at the most advanced tanks in the world. Moscow, December 1941. German Panzers were 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. Soviet defenders dug in among the suburbs and industrial districts. The 316th Rifle Division, defending the approaches near Volokholamsk, received crates of Molotov cocktails when their anti-tank guns were destroyed. German tactical reports from December 1941 describe Soviet infantry emerging from ruined buildings, often in groups of 3 or 4, targeting individual tanks with multiple bottles thrown simultaneously. One documented engagement: a Panzer III attempted to cross a destroyed bridge. Soviet soldiers hidden in the rubble threw 6 Molotov cocktails in rapid succession. The tank's engine caught fire. The crew abandoned the vehicle, which burned for 3 hours before the ammunition detonated. The psychological impact was immediate. German tank crews began to fear urban combat, understanding that every ruined building could hide soldiers with bottles that could transform their armored protection into a burning coffin. Stalingrad, September 1942 to February 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad turned the Molotov cocktail into an art form. Soviet defenders fighting in the ruins developed tactics specifically optimized for close-range anti-tank combat. The storm groups consisted of 6 to 8 infantry with rifles, 1-2 men with Molotov cocktails, 1 man with anti-tank grenades. Tactics: 1. Infantry engaged tank supporting troops with rifle fire. 2. Tank isolated from its infantry support. 3. Cocktail throwers approached from dead angles. 4. Multiple bottles thrown at engine deck, tracks, vision ports. 5. If crew bailed out, they were shot immediately. Soviet records claim storm groups destroyed over 500 German armored vehicles in Stalingrad, using primarily Molotov cocktails and improvised explosives. One famous incident. Soviet soldiers defending a factory building destroyed 7 tanks in a single engagement, using only Molotov cocktails. They dropped the bottles from upper-story windows onto the tank roofs, where armor was thinnest and engine vents were located. German reports from Stalingrad began referring to Soviet defenders as fanatics because they would wait until tanks were within 5 to 10 meters before attacking. This wasn't fanaticism. It was the effective range of the weapon. Kursk, July 1943. Even during large-scale tank battles, Molotov cocktails played a role. Soviet infantry defending prepared positions would allow German tanks to pass through the first line of defense, then attack the rear armor with Molotov cocktails, while anti-tank guns engaged from the front. At the village of Poniri, Soviet records indicate infantry destroyed or disabled 27 German tanks using Molotov cocktails when their anti-tank guns were destroyed by German artillery. Berlin, April 1945. The weapon that began as desperate improvisation in 1941 remained effective 4 years later. Soviet assault groups attacking German defensive positions in Berlin used Molotov cocktails against Panther and Tiger tanks immobilized by rubble, defensive positions in buildings, crews of disabled vehicles. German defenders also used improvised incendiary bottles against Soviet armor, having learned the tactic from their enemies. Documented effectiveness. Soviet military records claim approximately 3,500 German armored vehicles destroyed by Molotov cocktails, countless more damaged or temporarily disabled. Innumerable German infantry casualties from defensive use. German records are less specific, but confirm substantial losses to infantry close assault weapons in urban combat. The true number will never be known, as many tanks destroyed by multiple weapons, mines, grenades, cocktails, were counted under whichever weapon seemed most significant. The Soviet Molotov cocktail was not unique, but it was the most systematically produced and employed. The Soviet incendiary bottle was not unique. What made it different was scale, consistency, and integration. During the Winter War, Finnish forces relied on improvised incendiary bottles as an emergency measure. They were cheap and effective, but unreliable. Ignition often failed, and each bottle was essentially handmade. Britain developed a far more sophisticated incendiary grenade early in the war. It was chemically advanced, highly effective, and produced in large numbers. However, it was always intended as a temporary solution. Abandoned once proper anti-tank weapons became widely available. Germany adopted incendiary bottles late in the war, under very different circumstances. These were not standardized weapons, but desperate improvisations used when industrial production and logistics were collapsing. The United States, by contrast, had little need for such weapons. American forces possessed abundant dedicated anti-tank systems and armor support, limiting the role of improvised incendiaries to isolated situations. The Soviet approach sat between these extremes. By thickening fuel, they created incendiary compounds that clung to vertical surfaces instead of dripping away. These mixtures burned longer, hotter, and more predictably than liquid fuel alone. Equally important was ignition. Early methods relied on burning cloth fuses, which were unreliable and dangerous. Later innovations eliminated external ignition entirely by using self-igniting chemical reactions triggered only upon impact. By 1942, the incendiary bottle was no longer an improvised weapon. It was a standardized factory-produced system. Millions were produced across the Soviet Union, filled in distilleries, factories, and field depots. They were labeled, packed in crates, and distributed like any other military supply. The economics were staggering. An incendiary bottle cost a tiny fraction of a single anti-tank round. Yet one successful throw could disable or destroy a tank worth hundreds of thousands of rubles. The cost-effectiveness was almost absurd. The Soviet Molotov cocktail was not unique, but it was the most systematically produced and employed. Limitations. Range. The fundamental limitation was range. Throwing distance rarely exceeded 20-30 meters. This put attackers well within machine gun range. Soviet doctrine accepted this. The weapon was meant for desperate situations, not ideal combat. Casualty rate. Soldiers attacking tanks with Molotov cocktails suffered horrific casualties. German machine guns killed countless Soviet troops before they could close to effective range. But one soldier with a 5-cent bottle could destroy a tank worth thousands. The mathematics, however brutal, made sense to Soviet commanders. Weather. Rain, snow, and wind all reduced effectiveness. Wet surfaces prevented proper adhesion. Wind could extinguish fuses or blow the liquid away. Smoke. Burning tanks produced enormous smoke clouds, often hindering follow-up attacks or allowing crew to escape under cover. Legacy. By 1943, improved anti-tank weapons made Molotov cocktails less necessary. PTRS-41 anti-tank rifles, RPG-43 shaped charge grenades, American-supplied bazookas, better Soviet anti-tank guns. Production declined but never stopped entirely. The weapon remained useful for partisan warfare, urban combat, situations where proper weapons were unavailable. OST war influence. The Molotov cocktail became the universal symbol of improvised resistance. Hungarian uprising, 1956. Czechoslovakia, 1968. IRA conflicts. Palestinian intifadas. Modern urban protests worldwide. Modern military forces still train with incendiary bottles for bunker clearing, vehicle disabling, riot control. The principle remains valid. A burning liquid in a fragile container thrown at a target will always be an effective weapon requiring minimal resources. November 30th, 1939. The Karelian Isthmus. A glass bottle arcs through frozen air. It shatters. A tank burns. A crew dies. The weapon costs 5 cents. By 1945, Soviet factories had produced 6 million of them. They had destroyed thousands of German tanks. They had killed tens of thousands of tank crews. A bottle, gasoline, a rag. The Molotov cocktail was never elegant. It was never sophisticated. It was desperate. It was brutal. It was Soviet. And when a poorly trained conscript with a bottle worth 5 cents could destroy a Panzer worth more than most Soviet citizens earned in a lifetime, sophistication became irrelevant. 800 degrees Celsius. A burning crew. A mobile coffin. That was Soviet improvisation under pressure. That was the Red Army's answer to German engineering superiority. And that was how the Soviet Union proved that sometimes the most primitive weapon is the most effective.